Okay, so last week we talked about the reliability of the Old Testament manuscripts. We talked about especially the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they just show that even over 1,000 years from the oldest Old Testament manuscripts we had, there was a 1,000-year gap between that and Jesus' time. And even then, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they show that it didn't change over that 1,000 years, which is kind of incredible. But we're going to look at the reliability of the New Testament manuscripts. And there's 4 things we're going to look at just to help support the fact that we have what we have today is what happened then. I mean, how would you like to get, you go up to heaven and you find out, oh, those things were all changed. You believed in the wrong God, so you can't come in. So anyway.
That's depressing, thank you.
But if you know it's the right one, you can have some faith that, hey. So the 4 things we're going to look at is the Old Testament, oral tradition, verbatim memorization that they've had among the rabbis near that day, as well as we're going to look at some eyewitness things. Then over 5,000 ancient manuscripts give support. That's a lot. Ancient Greek manuscripts. 9,000 copies of ancient versions or translations. There's Syriac, there's, I can't think right now. There's a bunch of different ones that were translated. The Greek was translated into those. Then there's 37,000 quotations from early church fathers. These are real early church fathers. That Greek, they wrote in Greek, most of them. So I've got all these, if you ever want to look at them, these are the early church fathers up to probably 325 AD. All the things they wrote. And okay. What was the situation before the New Testament books were written? Well, there's about 16 to 19 years between the first New Testament book, which is probably Galatians, which was written in 49 AD, and about 60 to 70 years with respect to the last book written from the time when Jesus was here. So Jesus is here about what year? When did he die, you think?
33.
Pardon?
33.
Yeah, 33, or it might be 30 now. They're getting some more ideas that it probably was about 30. So what happened between those 16 to 70 years? How do you know these guys? John was probably almost 100 years old when he wrote Revelation and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and John. Can us old guys remember very well? The question and things like that. Or even the young people, can they remember? It's all about our memory. So how could we be sure that the accuracy of the accuracy of the Gospels and New Testament writings that were written about Jesus? Well, this is, I don't know if you can see it from there, but these are, can you see it?
No.
Okay, can the rest of you see it?
Okay.
Now you can see it. You've got the first book that was written was about what? What's that say up there? 49 AD. What's the second one?
50 AD.
And what was it?
James.
And so the first one written by Paul, the second one by James, Jesus' brother. Then you got 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, about 51 AD. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans. And then you come to the first gospel that's written. Okay, so this tells about Jesus, right? And so first gospel may be written about 55 to 60 AD. Some people want to push it clear back into the 80s, but I think that's pretty accurate. Luke about 59 to 63. I'm getting a hard time seeing this too, Lori. Colossians have some more books by Paul. And then you have Philippians by Paul, Acts by Dr. Luke, who is a companion of Paul. And then 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, Hebrews, 1 2 Peter. And then you got Matthew, clear down to 60 to 70 AD. Pretty soon you got John. So you got the Gospels are written If you take Mark as the earliest one, 55, so when was that? About 25 years after Jesus, right? So these guys, now Mark was a companion of Peter, and they think he wrote down what Peter said, Jesus said, and what happened. And Luke was a companion of Paul, and he wrote down from Paul's perspective. And then John, of course, was Jesus' apostle, was with him all the time. And Matthew also was a companion. He was also called Levi of Jesus. So you've got all these different dates, and you got all this time. So something happened, let's see if something happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. What would that be? What happened 60 years ago? Does anybody know? 1963? You was born?
I was born in 1963.
Yeah. You were born in 63? You don't remember what happened in 60?
3 days before I was born, there was a president that was assassinated.
Exactly. President, which president? John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. Now, how many of you remember that?
I remember hearing about
Linda put her hand up.
it. Oh, sorry, lady.
So, I wasn't an eyewitness account, but I was there in the sense that I existed, and we saw things on TV, what they were saying. I also experienced something that they came up to, the principal of our grade school, I was in 5th grade, came up to our class at noon. I remember it was noon, I don't know why. And they said, well, we're dismissing school because the president got shot. So, I don't even know if they knew he had died yet. So I'm an ear witness here. I mean, sort of an ear witness to that. But you guys don't. You don't have any, you weren't, how many were alive when they landed on the moon? Okay, some of us, we were up in the mountains with the sheep. And it was in the summer, July 20th. And we came down, and I remember getting down here because we didn't have a TV up there. And Grand Junction, you only had Channel 5. That's it. CBS, nothing else. There wasn't anything else, so we didn't even get to watch the Broncos, so I didn't become a Bronco fan. I become more of a Green Bay Packer fan at the time. Anyway, I remember and we got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we watched them land on the moon, watched the first step. And it was really an incredible thing. But if you don't have those, even if that's secondhand, those firsthand type things, how do you know it's true? And so you get all these people later on that say, well, they never landed on the moon. It was just all made up. Okay? President Kennedy never got shot. He never got killed. All these things were made up. And so you go down through time, people can say, well, all these things were made up. I mean, look, there's 25 years between Jesus when he was here and the first gospel. So how do you know? Maybe it was completely changed. Maybe the church wanted to believe that Jesus really was alive and he was the Messiah. So maybe they just created all this stuff that Jesus did all these miracles, that he died and he resurrected. There are people, scholars today, that believe that. Okay? And yet they're still religious people. Hi, Dee Dee.
Hi.
I saved you my big print Bible, unless you brought your own.
No, I didn't.
Do you want a big print one so you can see?
Oh, I can see this one probably.
Well, here, just in case.
Okay.
I'll have to hit you with this wand.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, the question is a good question. You know, how do you know How can you trust that what we have was written down even in the Gospels is really what Jesus said? Well, we're going to look at a couple things here. I can get my computer to go. There we go. And here's some more details. How do we know, again, that they haven't changed what we have? All the original manuscripts have been lost. So I gave you the list of all when those were written. We don't have any original copies. Do you have an original copy of the United States Constitution? Yeah. I don't know exactly where it's at.
Yeah.
Do we have any?
Glass.
What's that?
It's behind glass.
Yeah. But we don't have any original copies. All of the original manuscripts have been lost. They were copied and given to Christians all over the Roman Empire. That's what they did. They would copy them. Then when it got tattered, they'd throw them out. Okay? Because you got a new one. Now it's in good shape. Lots of them. Even though the New Testament was originally based on eyewitness accounts, can we trust the writings as conveying the truths accurately? Can we trust copies? I think there's ample evidence to say yes. I hope you wanted me to say that. Otherwise, our faith is on shaky ground. Okay, so I'm going to look at the four witnesses. And sub 4:1 here is a testimony of eyewitnesses. It's interesting, if you really want to dig into this, there's a guy in 2017 wrote Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And what he does is he goes and talks about how eyewitnesses can be trusted or not. And so he goes and he shows that the situation about Jesus and where he was at and what was going on, that the eyewitness accounts of that situation are most probably very accurate. He says, I shall argue in this book the period between the historical Jesus, when he died, and the Gospels, which we just talked about, were actually spanned not by anonymous community transmission, but by continuing presence and testimony of the eyewitnesses who remain the authoritative source of their traditions until their deaths. What he's saying is that the eyewitnesses became the standard. And that's what people looked up to. In fact, the early church, when they were trying to find out which writings they should have, they had to trace it back to an apostle, because they wanted to have that eyewitness account. Whereas if it was just a big community after Jesus died, there wasn't any necessarily eyewitnesses, and they start just, oh, he must have did this, he must have did this. You're gonna really have some variations there quite a bit. He also says in the back, he says the eyewitnesses who remembered the events of the history of Jesus were remembering inherently very memorable events. I mean, that's why I can tell you what I remember about President Kennedy. It was a shock, right? And you remember that? You were alive too. There's another witness. Okay, there's only 3 or 4 of us in here. Or when they landed on the moon, it was something that was vivid, something that you remember details about. That's what it was with Jesus. I mean, somebody raising someone from the dead, or teaching like he did. So it was just different teaching. You know, you heard it and you remembered it. The eyewitnesses remembered the events of the history of Jesus and remember inherently memorable events, unusual events that would have impressed themselves on the memory, events of key significance for those who remembered them, landmark or life-changing events for them in many cases. And their memories would have been reinforced and stabilized by frequent rehearsal beginning soon after the event. I mean, they were going to tell the stories. And probably not deviate as much, because when you get something that's really embedded in your mind, I can remember seeing my dad when he was dead. First one, okay? And I remember that. I don't think I'll forget just seeing that. He says also, we may conclude that the memories of eyewitnesses of the history of Jesus score highly in the criteria for likely reliability that have been established by the psychological study of recollective memory. So he talks about some of those things. He talks about if it was a unique or unusual event, you're most likely going to remember it. If it was salient or consequential event, you have to look at that. I'm not sure what he means there. The event in which a person is emotionally involved. Okay, you're going to remember those things. Vivid imagery. Okay, there were some vivid things that, I mean, can you imagine Jesus standing there and say, "Peace, be still"? What do you say that to? The water stopped. I mean, that was not something that wasn't. It was just, oh, everybody does that. And then some other things it says. So if you want to look into that more, you can get this book, or I can let you borrow it. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by a guy named, how do you say his name? Buckham? Buckham. Something like that. Okay, so there's some pretty good reasons that you can remember, or that eyewitness could remember, and you remember that all of them would have been alive, almost all of them, not James, the one who was killed in Acts, but most of the apostles and even other eyewitnesses that were there. I mean, maybe Mary was saying things. You know, she was a pretty good eyewitness. There's some other eyewitnesses. So the eyewitnesses lived, and quite many years later, some people were killed for their testimony. I mean, Paul was, what was he? Was he beheaded? Can't remember. But Peter was crucified upside down. But that was in the 60s. So that's 30 years later. Okay, 60 AD. So you've got some long time here for those eyewitnesses to really make sure they could say, they could correct, no, it didn't happen that way. You know, things like that. And then there's a testimony of oral tradition. Now, what oral tradition means is that you hear something and you repeat it. Now, you've probably all heard about, you know, where they get 15 or 20 people together and you say something real fast in someone's ear.
Oh, yeah.
So what does the last person say? It has nothing to do with it. Well, how do you know? Maybe some people were saying this and it had nothing to do with it. Well, there was a Scandinavian scholar in 1961 who did some research. He called it Memory and Manuscript, Oral Tradition and Written Transmission in Rabbinic Judaism and Early Christianity. And he looked into how the rabbis in the 2nd century, and he thinks probably it went back to the 1st century as well, how the rabbis helped people remember stuff. What did they do when they taught? And they had all kinds of techniques that enabled them to remember verbatim teaching that they heard. Garrison shows evidence that the rabbis in the 1st century AD probably had access to these techniques as well. We're kind of lazy today. If we want to hear what somebody said, we'll probably Google it. And we'll re-listen to it. But it's not up here as much, right? But in those days, they didn't even have a newspaper. And we don't have newspapers either. They didn't have anything to record anything. And so they were more desperate. Okay, if somebody comes and reads an edict by the emperor, you probably better know what it says. You might have your head lopped off. You know, so it's important to understand that their culture was different. And they had ways to remember. I remember him saying something like, even a 20-minute sermon, they could have they were trained on how to just remember that. And we've got some people that can do things like that already just because they have, I don't know if it's high IQ or they got photographic memory. But these guys didn't necessarily have that. But they might have audio memory. So they was able to do this. And so it's not out of the question that these would be transferred down from person to person more accurately than anything we would do today. Does that make sense? Yeah, because it's a different culture.
Go back to that.
Oh, sorry.
That one line says, C.W.K. Gleher,
Oh,
in which he
this-
shows how rabbis in the 2nd century AD taught memory techniques to their disciples.
right. And he thinks this probably went back a little bit earlier into the 1st century, which is what we're talking about today. But it shows that it can be done. They had memory technique. It's probably pretty expensive to always have a scroll, and they had their own teachings. They had the Mishnah, which I showed you, a big book like that. Well, I don't know how many copies of that they have, but it's easier if people can just remember it. It's kind of neat when you listen to The Chosen, and you hear these religious leaders. And they try to quote pretty close to what they don't have the book in front of them. It's probably more accurate than it's probably pretty accurate what they did. Okay, are we all done there? Yeah, CWK Glerup's a publisher. Lund, and it was in Sweden, and 1961. And there was another book that he updated in 1964. Okay, so anyway, that was a testimony of how they might have been able to, in that period between when the Gospels were written and when Jesus was around, how there's a good reason to believe that what they had was, and what they wrote down was really what Jesus said. And you also had the Gospel writers there and who were alive then too. Now, this is interesting too. The testimony of ancient Greek manuscripts supports there are over 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, or portions of it. Now, that's from way back as far as you can go, up to, I don't know, whenever they quit writing in Greek, maybe 500, 600, 700 AD. I'm not really sure.
To the end of the Middle Ages.
Oh, I already got it right there. There you go. Okay. They all speak with reliability of the New Testament. There are very few differences, and those that exist are not significant in the sense that, maybe they'll say a person, trying to think of what it might be. Maybe a person said hello, and maybe another one would said hi. Or, it wasn't that big a deal. And very few differences. There are some differences. We'll be looking at a few things here in a few minutes. But they aren't theologically significant. And there's differences in John's gospel and then the other three. But we can, someday maybe we can look at that. But it's kind of neat how close they are, at least the synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is a completely different way of looking at things. But they don't disagree with each other in the basic facts of what happened. In fact, there are so many manuscripts that one can trace different families of manuscripts and find when a variant occurred. These manuscripts span a time period of 125 to the end of the Middle Ages. Now, so here's what you got. Archaeologists are digging up these different manuscripts in the radiocarbon datum or whatever they do to date them, and they put them in the dating time, wherever it's at, and they're able to go back and trace families of manuscripts. What that means is that, let's say you found this 125 AD. This wasn't very big. It was only maybe 5 words or something. So it wasn't much. They just found it. But it was part of John's gospel. But suppose you found, let's go a little bit later, and we find a manuscript. And then you find a later manuscript. And you compare the two. And then you find another manuscript, maybe another 100 years later, and you find it, and it's got something a little bit different. Okay, maybe it's added a word or two. Okay, but the intermediate one didn't. And then you find these other manuscripts that date the same as these earlier ones, and then they have a copy, but it doesn't have what this has over here. Okay, now, and then you find another one that was maybe copied off of this one, and it agrees with this one, but not with that one. And then what you find, sometimes you can find, is that, like we showed it in the one manuscript that we looked at in the Old Testament, Isaiah, is that sometimes you can find where this one here, and then there's a change, and then everything after it is changed. Sometimes it'll be in the margin. Maybe it's a comment. And the next guy who copies it puts a comment in. And it goes and goes and goes until you got that comment way down the line. But you have these others that are balancing it. So you can go back and you can say, oh, okay, that's we can tell where that started. And you can say, okay, this is an older manuscript, doesn't have it in it, so, and other older manuscripts don't either, so most likely it was added by a scribe who's copying it. So, but there's 5,000. I don't know if I quite understand it, but one of my professors says that New Testament scholars are almost embarrassed by how many there are. You don't need them. So, to prove that the New Testament is really accurate. I don't think I like the term must be embarrassed, but that's what he said. It was Dr. Carson. Anyway, just to look at some important early manuscripts. The John Rylands manuscript, it's just, like I said, just a little piece, was found, it dates 125 to 130 AD, found in Egypt. It is only a portion of a verse or two of John's gospel. It is important in that the Gospel of John can be no longer dated by liberal scholars at 200 AD. They were saying, well, John didn't write. It's a different kind of writing. It's more theological. That had to be developed over a period of time. So it would have been way down like 200 and something AD. Well, something wrong with that if we get this one to 125. Then there's a Chester Beatty papyri. And what I want you to do, what I'm doing is going to do some papyri, but that handout I gave you on the back, yeah, if you want to look at all these are just the papyri. These aren't the codexes or books or the other things that they copied on animal skins and stuff like that. This is just the papyri, and if you look on here, it'll give you the century. Okay, and so you can go through there and you can see all of these different ones. And here, these guys who put together the New Testament checked all those out. It's just incredible. So the Greek New Testament, and what they do here is if there is a little bit of a variation, they make note of it here and they give it weight. Okay, is it probably true? Probably not. So, but it's amazing. How would you like to learn Greek? Learn how to be a paleographer, and then look at all those manuscripts and compare all of them with each other. And these are just the manuscript. This is just the what do I want to say? The papyrus. Blows my mind. Okay, but that's not it. That's not all. But I wanted you to know where we're talking about papyri here.
Do you
Yeah.
have a copy of what you handed?
Yeah. Was there?
I think we're out of those.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you might have got one. Maybe you didn't, but that's okay. It's the last page. And bring that next week because we're going to talk about some more things when we go through the canon. Okay. Now, here's some more. Codex Sinaiticus. Where do you think that was found? Sinai. Yeah, about that. Okay. They give it the Hebrew letter Aleph. It contains all the New Testament except for Mark 16, 19 through 20, John 7, 53 through 11, 8, 11, and we'll talk about those. It was found in 1844 at the traditional site of Mount Sinai in a monastery there. It was found in a wastebasket where monks there had been using old manuscripts as firewood to keep warm. It was discovered by a guy named Tischendorf and is now in London in the museum. So, this is so old a book. Over 1,000 years old. More than that. What's 1844 minus 350? 1,500 years old. And here this is. See, like I told you, they'll copy these manuscripts, and then they put them in a wastebasket. They'll if they're getting tattered, they'll use them for firewood. He just happened to see it there. What's this doing in here? Whoa! Wait a minute, you monks! What are you doing? Burning up the ancient manuscripts. And so this is an incredible find because it it contains the whole New Testament. And you can look at what they wrote back then and compare to what we have today and say, okay, what's it look like? Is it different? There's Codex Vaticanus. Where do you think that's found? Vatican! Okay, and it's given the letter B. It's in the Vatican, housed in the Vatican Library. Contains nearly all the Bible, Old and New Testament, but omits the book of Revelation. Okay, it's got everything but the book of Revelation. Codex Alexandrinus is 400 AD. It's in the British Museum. It contains all the New Testament, Old Testament. It does contain Revelation. Okay. When compared to other ancient writings, the support of New Testament text integrity is incredibly abundant. In your handout, I want you to look at something. On page 9, it says of the notes. Okay, you can see this little chart here. Remember, we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts to. Okay, so you've got all these. You've got over 5,000 Greek manuscripts for us to check out the reliability of the New Testament. Well, you might say, well, so what? Well, look at these others. In what is written about Caesar, it was written 100 to 44 BC. Earliest manuscript is 900 AD. It's 1,000 years between him. Plato, 427 to 347 BC. The earliest we have is 900 AD. That's 1,200 years. Tacitus, 100 AD. There's 1,000 years there. Suetonius, which he wrote about the 12 Caesars. There's 800 years between the earliest, between when it was written and the earliest manuscript we have. Herodotus, it's 1,300 years. Sophocles, 1,400 years. Euripides, 1,500 years. Aristotle, 1,400 years. Aristophanes, 1,200 years. The New Testament, you can look at 30 to 75 years if you take the 125. But even if you took the 300, it's still a lot closer than these others. So there's, and look at how many copies over here. Okay, so the reason for doing that is most people will accept what Aristotle wrote. They don't question it, right? Well, why not? You question the Bible, why question us? Or Sophocles, or Herodotus, or Suetonius, Plato. Probably people accept Plato, but there's only seven earliest copies. Only seven, what is it? Number of copies was only about 7. So, and I don't know exactly how they figured that, but it's just showing that there's a plethora of evidence that will help you to have confidence in the Old Testament or New Testament. The Testament of ancient versions and translations. There are in existence over 9,000 copies of early versions. Now, there's different versions. These are versions that were translated from Greek into Syriac, into others. And over 9,000 copies of them. So you could do the same thing, and these guys have. They go in the New Testament Greek, they go and have checked all that out. Right? It just overwhelms me. Okay, then it says the Syriac Peshitta version, translated about 150 to 250 AD from Greek. There exists more than 320 extant manuscripts of this version. There's also an old Syriac version copied about 300 to 400 AD, which contains the 4 Gospels. Old Latin versions. Jerome, in the Catholic Church that was beginning to be formed then, he translated the whole Bible into Latin. And so you can go back and translate. Okay, let's look at the Latin. Now, what does that agree with? You know, it's a little bit different because you're going from one language to another. But let's check the Latin if it agrees with the Greek that we have way back. And so you check all those out. There's a Coptic version, Egyptian, including Sahidic, which dates from the early 3rd century. So you're getting way back there. That's in the 200s. You can compare them and see, okay, is what we have today what what we have then. Armenian version in the 5th century AD. Ethiopic versions, 5th century AD. Georgian? This version's 5th century. Old Slavonic versions of the 9th century. And so you got these 9,000 manuscripts of these translations way back there. Now, this is incredible too. Remember I said this is the early church fathers here? There are over 37,000 quotations of the New Testament by the early church fathers. Some of them might be allusions, but you can still check them out. 37,000 quotations from the New Testament in Greek, because they wrote in Greek, from early church leaders, which also speak to the reliability of the New Testament and its integrity. Some of these include Clement of Rome, who wrote from 90 to 100 AD. He quotes much from Paul and other New Testament writers. One of his key phrases is, "It is written," showing that this is scripture. And Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, he lived 70 to 110 AD, somewhere around there. He quotes from 15 New Testament books. Other church fathers, Polycarp, a disciple of John the Apostle. Justin Martyr has 330 quotes from the New Testament. Clement of Alexandria has 2,406 quotes from all but 3 New Testament books. Bishop of Lyons, Irenaeus, has 1,819 quotes. Tertullian has 7,258 quotes. Origen has 17,922 quotes from the New Testament. Hippolytus has 1,378. Cyprian has 1,000 New Testament quotes. Eusebius, the early church historian, has over 5,000. If you want to read Eusebius, I've got some things up here too. He's a church historian. So, can we trust the integrity of the New Testament text that we have? Well, Frederick Kenyon, who is an authority in the New Testament, says it cannot be too strongly asserted that the text of the Bible is certain, especially is the case with the New Testament. The number of manuscripts, of early translations from it, and of the quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. Thus, this can be said of no other ancient book in the world. Now, we're going to look at, there are some deviations, okay? So I want you to be aware of those. So, if you can look up Acts 8:37, see if you could find it. Acts 8:37. So I hope this gives some reason, if people start claiming that you can't trust what was written, that it's changed, that it gives some reason to, you can debate that, if you will. God's taking care of his word. What's Acts 8:37? Someone find that? Where do you find Acts 8:37? 8:37. Can you find it? Where's 8:37? Can somebody read 8:37, please?
I can read at the bottom.
Oh, it's on the bottom. What's the bottom say?
It says that some manuscripts include here, Philip said, if you believe with all your heart, you may.
Okay.
Enoch answered, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
And so those words, if you look at it, are omitted by all. If you remember the 350, A, which is a Codex Alexandrinicus, B is Vaticanus, C, all those are really, really early manuscripts. Papyrus P47, the 3rd century, doesn't have it. King James has this verse because it was based on later manuscripts. I think it was 8 later manuscripts is how they translated King James, which had included this. One of the earliest manuscripts, which has included Greek manuscripts, is about the 6th century. So they've traced it back. Oh, we can find out when this started. Someone wanted to explain that they had to say, well, if you believe in Jesus, you can. They wanted to make sure that, and it doesn't contradict anything, but it just wasn't there. Okay, it wasn't part of the first what was written. And so these are the type of things that they find. Just a little bit. These are the bigger ones. Okay, there's a lot of other spelling and everything, different, smaller things. Okay, find John 5, 3b through 4. Can you find that one? Do you find John 5, 5, 4? Can you find 5, 4? Chapter John 5. John 5 verses, just verse 4. We'll just
Not
look.
one, John.
No. This is the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 4. It's in a footnote again. What's up with that? Okay, it's actually second part of verse 3 and 4. What's that say? Does anybody want to say that?
For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the waters.
Okay, so it's giving some type of explanation, who knows where it came from, about the guy who was gonna, what was he gonna do? Get into the pool and be healed, right? So this came from somewhere. But it's not in the earliest manuscripts, P46, which is P stands for papyrus, and these others, Aleph, Beth, B, C, and D, and others, A in the 5th century includes it. So it's interesting, all of these older manuscripts don't have it, but they found that it occurred first around the 5th century with the manuscript. Some of the 5,000 manuscripts show, looking at that, shows that's when it started. So somewhere along the line, in the 5th century, somehow it was added. We don't know. But you've got these other manuscripts that show, well, somebody added it. It wasn't really what was originally. John 7, this is an interesting one. 7:53. If you look in your Bible, see what it says there. Does anybody have some comments on John 7:53 through 8:11? This is the woman caught in adultery. Okay, this whole thing, 7:53 through 8:11, basically starts at chapter 8. What's it say there? Any comments? Or anybody want to read it?
The earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. A few manuscripts include these verses wholly or in part after John 7:36, John 21:25, Luke 21:38, or Luke 24:24.
Wow. This happens all, it's like it's jumping around with different people. You find it here, you don't find it there. You find it there, you even find it in Luke. That's really kind of weird. Anyway, it's omitted by the P66 second and third centuries, P75 third century, Aleph, that's Codex Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and B and C and others. It is included in the D, which is a Western text, I believe, the 5th or 6th century. Some later manuscripts, like we said, have it in different places. So scholars believe that this might have been one of those floating stories about Jesus that was true, but it wasn't put in until later when people felt like, well, this was really a true story, so let's stick it in somewhere. So, anyway, you'll find very many of those. This is an amazing one. Okay. Then here's a big one.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So what's a short, easy way to tell somebody this stuff?
Well, I'm just giving you a lot.
I know, but I'm like, if somebody questions it, what would be an easy way to explain it without, here, listen to Glenn.
Yeah. Probably by reading to the footnotes.
Uh-huh.
Just saying, okay, the ancient manuscripts don't have this in there. That's why we don't have it. Now, there is a King James movement. I think King James was the one, sometimes they say Paul used, version Paul used. And so some of those claim that that's the only inspired version. So you may come across people that say that. But, your mom? Yeah. The problem is, if you go and look at the manuscripts like we have, why trust King James translation of the later manuscripts? But a lot of it's just tradition, I think, that people, and there's nothing wrong with King James, except maybe you don't understand it, but I mean, these things aren't going to hurt anything. I mean, what's in there? Just so you might talk about the meticulousness of the scholars who have looked through the 5,000, the 37,000, all these different manuscripts and everything else. Say, wow, there's really not any reason to doubt what the New Testament says is what was written. Does that help any?
I don't doubt, but I just know that you're going to run across people that doubt. It's like, well, if it wasn't the earlier manuscript, why is it?
Yeah. It's because the scribe may have made a comment on the side, and the next person who he wrote it in, next person who copied it, or maybe the person who was reading it, sometimes they had groups of maybe 25 people that were copying, and you had a reader, and they copied things down. Maybe the reader even read that. And so then they put it, it's called interpolations. They bring it into the text, which it wasn't really there. So it could be comment, it could be different things. But the whole point that I'm trying to share is that we have the ability to figure these out, basically, because there's so many manuscripts. You can check so many translations, so many things out, that you can see how God has really preserved his word. Is that helpful? I would just have him go and read what it says in these. I don't know if King James might not say that, but anyway. So this one is the last one we're going to look at. Mark 16, 9 through 20. If you look at that, you will also find that your Bible should say something about that. If somebody wants to read what it has in noting that. Mark 16. Does anybody have, does it say anything? Mark 16, verse 9 or verse 8.
It says the most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9.
Okay. So why would they want to change it? Well, or add to it? Well, in the Greek, the last words are, and they were afraid. Do you want to stop the gospel with that? And so some people think that they then added these just to try to discover or help people understand what's going on. It's interesting, there's two different endings. Or the ending could have been lost. Some people think, well, if this was a codex, which is another term for book, and it's interesting that Mark starts with Jesus and his ministry. Doesn't talk about his birth. And it ends with this. Some people think, well, it could have been like leaves on the back of the book, and that portion was lost. And they copied that. I don't know. Like the book that lost its cover, first and last pages. It's omitted by Aleph and B, and is found in ACD, 5th and 6th century manuscripts. This ending is a long ending. There's also exists a shorter ending that you can find in the New American Standard Bible, and it says this. And this is after it says they were afraid. They promptly reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions. After that, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Okay, so they felt like there should be a better ending somehow. So you got two different endings, and that's not bad. I mean, I don't think that would be wrong, what they said there. So you find these are the major ones that you find. You find little words, different things. but it's incredible because these people, I don't have these people that put together the New Testament have checked out all these things, and they'll tell you it's called the apparatus, the part in the bottom, how they rate it and which manuscripts, old manuscripts or new manuscripts, have what. And so I did some manuscript stuff, but I didn't do anything like that.
But
That-
aren't a lot of, just a question, I guess,
Mhm.
so the portion that it says that was not in those manuscripts, aren't a lot of those portions of this portion in different places in other books, though?
For
Like-
instance.
Like it talks about here how he says to go into the world and preach the gospel to all
Yeah,
creation,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So then it's actually in Matthew,
Right.
where he gives the Great Commission, or
Yeah.
there's another.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that those are wrong doctrinally.
Exactly.
No.
They're in other places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Mark 16:16 says, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Well, that's pretty consistent. Or other things in there. Now, one of the things about this 16, though, is that you wonder sometimes, and this is what Pentecostals will hold on to, is chapter in that 16 verses. What's it say?
Snakes. Is it the picking up snakes part?
Yeah. So that's why I know I don't take that, not just for that reason, but because I don't think it was an original. I don't take that as gospel. In fact, John Lust told me about a professor he had in Greek, and he opened up his Greek Bible to the last chapter of Mark, and after verse 9 and following, it's just all crossed out in black. He just wiped it out because it wasn't really there. So let's look at that. Let's look. So I try to trust that what is written, what the scholars have figured out, is accurate because of the just incredible amount of study that was done on just the history. But yeah, in chapter 16, where does it say that? It says, then he who believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. These signs will accompany those who believe in my name. They will drive out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well. So you've got a lot of things that are said in that passage. That's why you got some people out there taking the King James basically. They'll try to drink poison. It'll be okay. Or they'll pick up snakes. It'll be okay. Or they'll speak in what they think are tongues, which linguists have studied some of the things they claim to be tongues, and they're not really a different language, which is really what the Bible talks about. So when it talks about tongues, it's talking about language, not this sort of gibberish thing. Anyway, yes, there are some things in those that you wouldn't necessarily want to take as what the scriptures say. So, none of the variants are theologically significant. Even with the variants that are there, so many extant manuscripts exist that one can reconstruct the New Testament text with a high degree of certainty. If you can just figure it out. Hence, there's no reason to believe that the biblical text has changed significantly. We have the message of the Bible basically unchanged. So, if you look at the reality of the Bible, the whole thing, it's supported by the scrupulousness of the Masoretes. I don't know if you remember, we talked about the Masoretes, people who counted each Hebrew letter or word from the beginning to end, and they even knew where the middle one was. So if they counted it after they've copied it, and this wasn't the middle word or middle letter, they're going to redo it. So they were just incredible. The other extant ancient writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably the most important discovery for biblical reliability in the history of the Bible. Oral tradition, verbatim memorization, as well as eyewitnesses that we talked about. Over 5,000 ancient manuscripts, 9,000 copies of ancient versions. These are for New Testament. 37,000 quotations for early church fathers. They all speak for the reliability of the Bible's message unchanged. Some credits. Anyway, it really gives me confidence that it didn't change. I mean, I'm amazed at how this could come down like that. I mean, probably not the same with a lot of other books and things. So